What's going on? This is Ryan with Automatic Comics, and up next, we are going to talk about a crazy sale that just happened. The person, assuming it's the same person who bought the book previously, this person just lost about $46,000. Massive drop. Just this is one of those where it really gives you a clear picture of how much prices have returned to normal or corrected back since the peak comic boom. Let's check this one out. All right. So before we get started, please remember to hit that like button and hit the subscribe button if you'd like to see more content like this. So what we are talking about right here is a copy of Amazing Fantasy 15. And so this was part of the weekly Heritage Comic Auction. If you haven't watched my channel before, I talk about it a lot. The Heritage Auctions are just one of my favorites to follow because they are so regular. It's every single week. You have Golden Age on Sunday, Silver Age on Monday, and Bronze through Modern on Tuesday. So you get a lot of comics selling every week. They sell hundreds of thousands of dollars of comics a week. And so it does give you a pretty good picture of the market week to week. And so that's one of the big reasons I like to watch it. But if you haven't watched one of my kind of like recap videos or anything like that before, what I've got right here is this is the overview of the weekly Heritage Comic Auctions so far. And so you can go to these kind of like recap pages and it gives you a summary of all the results. You can see so far in the first two sessions, because this was after Monday that I saw this, there's been $492,933 in sales. That gives you really an idea how much sells in these because we haven't even had the Bronze through Modern stuff yet. Already at 500,000. But what I like to do is I like to take these results and I like to organize them from most expensive to least expensive. And when I do that, I'm looking for outliers, kind of like some interesting sales, some things that might be fun to talk about. And so the top two here were Amazing Fantasy 15. There's actually been quite a few AF15s that have been selling the last month or so and still coming up for sale. I'm not exactly sure why, since we had seen a ton of them last year. When prices were starting to drop, then we got kind of a lull in sales for them. And now they seem to be picking up again. And I've talked about Amazing Fantasy 15 quite a bit, where I feel like it has largely corrected back to where it should be and why I think it's a pretty safe book to buy right now. But we got two books here. We had a Universal 3.0 that went for 28,800. That's pretty much right in line. This is a book that's been going for around 10,000 a point. So 28,800. Pretty solid sale. I think last week a 3.5 sold for like 29,500. That one had kind of a weaker color strike. So, I mean, that is what it is. So this is actually a pretty solid sale. Then we had this next book, and that's the one we're going to talk about. Amazing Fantasy 15 qualified 6.0 went for 20,400. And just looking at that, I was like, oh, that's a pretty strong sale, given that this book is missing 2 wraps. So it's actually in reality, it's a 0.5, right? Like it's an incomplete book. It's a 0.5. We can see on the notes here, 2 center wraps missing, effects story incomplete. Now, this is a great looking book, so it's really sad that this is that it's a qualified 6.0. If you're not familiar with qualified labels, this is one of these things that CGC does, where if the book looks better than the grade for some reason, like a pop staple, or you see it often with Hulk 181, where the Marvel value stamp is cut out, that kind of thing. Instead of giving it the universal grade, they give it this qualified grade. My general experience has been is if it's 2 grades higher, at least, than what it would normally get, they will often use this qualified grade. And so since this is an incomplete book missing 2 wraps, this would get a 0.5. There's no question that if this is a universal book, it would get a 0.5. And so 20,400 for a 0.5 is a very strong sale. I mean, I would put a 0.5 right now, depending on how the book presents, anywhere from $10,000 to $15,000. That's kind of the range it's selling for right now. So this is effectively a 0.5 that sold for 20,400, which also shows the benefit of the qualified label in this case, because sometimes people talk about them as they're, these terrible things that really hurt value. But in this case, this at least added $5,000, $8,000 to the value of the book if this had sold as a 0.5 universal. That's not what we're here to talk about. So I saw this, this $20,400 sale, and I was like, I wonder, has, a qualified book sold before in this grade? How did this perform against other qualified books? And so I went over to GPA, which is one of the pricing tools that I use for pricing comics. I typically use a combination of GPA and Go Collect. And at the top here, it defaults to just showing you the universal results, but you can select to include restored books, qualified books, signed books. So selected the qualified. I scrolled down and I was looking at first I went down to the bottom like this, and I was just kind of like looking around at prices, looking for other qualified books. Then I got up to the 6.0 and I was like, what is this? $66,000, 2 center wraps missing. I was like, this has to be the same book. April 2022, there was a qualified 6.0 that sold for $66,000, missing 2 center wraps. That is almost what it was selling for Universal. Like when you looked at this is definitely something, I don't remember if I ever made a video about this one. I would have talked about this sale because if you look at a 6.0 Universal back in 2022, the peak sale had been 93,000 in September, had been 65,000 in August. I mean, that book actually sold for more than one of the Universal sales from that same year. Like that's how wild that sale was. And here's that book. And this is the exact same book. So you can see it's got the exact same serial number, 39647222002, and here 39647222002. So absolutely the same book. It's got the same flaws up in the corner up here, all that kind of stuff. So I was just like, if that was the same person that had bought this that decided to sell it now, I mean, they just lost $45,600, almost 70% exactly. And I mean, that is just wild, like wild on this individual book. Now, with Amazing Fantasy 15, if you look at other grades, I mean, if you look at some of these higher grade books, like a 6.5, and this 6.5 peaked. I mean, look at that, 225,000. Last sale, 105,000. So it has also fallen around 60%. I mean, Amazing Fantasy 15 did go absolutely crazy during the comic boom. I talked about it a lot because I was telling people be very careful with this book. It's spiking like everything else, and it ended up correcting like everything else. And you can see, like, this is a perfect example. This 6.5 for what I was talking about, it is right back in line. I mean, look at, and I know some people, they do not like that I talk about trend lines with the prices of comics, but I mean, all I can say is we have decades of information about sales prices for comics, and you can look at that information and at least glean something off of what a book might do in the future. Now, obviously, past performance doesn't guarantee future performance, that kind of stuff. But I mean, when you look at the general long-term trend for the last 22 years that are on here, it's got this pretty gradual uptrend. And it is now, like the 6.5, it's right back in line. And that's exactly why I have been able to comfortably say that if you were looking for an Amazing Fantasy 15 right now and you were buying around the current going market price, that your risk is relatively low. I mean, things can always drop more, all that kind of stuff, but risk is relatively low. But yeah, I mean, if it was the same person, I wonder if they were expecting this. I mean, maybe they were, maybe if they've seen all the other sales prices for this book, like you couldn't think that it would go for 66,000 again. I mean, we had a 6.0 recently here. You can see sell for 75,000 this month, and that was a Universal. And typically qualified books, you'll sometimes get them to sell upwards of 50 to 60% of value. But with really high dollar books like this, it's generally going to be a smaller percentage of value. And we can see that here. We had a 6.0 qualified here go for $20,000. There was a 6.0 Universal that went for 75. I mean, that's around 25, 26, somewhere in that range percent of value. And so that's about what I was more or less expecting for this book. I was thinking that this one would probably go somewhere in the $15,000 to $20,000 range because it was a very nice book. I mean, to me, this was actually a strong sale. I mean, when you talk about like what a point 0.5 would sell for, I mean, this was a solid sale for this book. Like if it had that point 0.5 universal label, I can almost guarantee it wouldn't have sold for 20. But yeah, I mean, this book has everything you really want in the cover, at least. It's got, really deep colors in the reds and the browns. It's like no Marvel chipping. I mean, it's a really, really solid presenting copy. I'm kind of surprised somebody didn't try to just like marry in the pages to at least complete the book. It still would have been a green label, and maybe they risk it dropping to a 5.5 or something like that. But that could have been some option that they had, but still losing $46,000. That, I mean, I know like people say it's like, oh, if like somebody has the money for that, they can afford to lose it. Not necessarily. I mean, I've seen plenty of people stretch for pretty expensive books. And so losing $46,000, I'm sure, is never a fun time. That was the main thing I wanted to touch on here. I also know that for a lot of people, like Amazing Fantasy 15 is the book. It's that grail book. And a lot of people have been fearful of it for a while. And so that's why I thought it would be at least useful to talk about how prices have corrected on this book. Just if you have been looking out there, I do feel like it is a relatively safe time to buy. I mean, let's look at some other books with recent sales. We've got a 5.0 recently sold for 49,200. Again, if you just kind of like, and this is if you're spending tens of thousands of dollars, like get something like GPA, like get something so at least it gives you an idea where you're in range for where something like this is going to sell. I mean, it's like $12 a month or something like that. If you're spending tens of thousands of dollars, you should spend $12 a month to get this pricing service. But if you just look at kind of like that general trend, I mean, you just look at the trend for this book, and it's right around there. I mean, I wouldn't have paid the 63. I think that 63 was very high for current prices, and that's why, somebody else was a little more patient. They picked up the next one for 49,200 like 10 days later. I mean, I'm sure like maybe there's something a little different about one of the books. I mean, here's the one that somebody paid 63,000 for. It's got some tanning and chipping on the side. So for everybody that tells me people don't pay high prices with Marvel chipping, right there. Then we've got the one that sold about a week later. It's got more Marvel chipping, but I mean, let's see, if I had to pick between this book and this book, it's tough. I'd probably pick the $50,000 book. Like, I don't like the tanning on the side as much. I think that deters my view a little bit more than the extra chipping. But everybody's going to have their own personal opinion, own personal preference on that. And this one actually has a little date stamp, which I think is pretty cool. So, like, I mean, to me, like the $50,000 book is probably like my preferred book of the two. Then, I mean, if we go and check out some other grades, just so you can kind of see that this isn't just at those higher grade books. Let's take a look at a 3.0 that just had this recent sale of 28,950. And again, you can see like this general trend line. I mean, if we just look at that, it's maybe a little high, but not much. And that's why you got to check each grade. You want to check each grade that you're interested in looking at. And so I would say 28.8 is maybe a little high for this one. It may get down somewhere around more like 25 or 26. And you can see there was actually one sale last year at 24,500, another one at 25.2. I mean, it did get down into that mid 20s range, and it's come back up a little bit. So depending on the grade, check each book and just pay accordingly. I mean, if you look at the general trends for this book, I mean, here we've got a 2.5. Again, general trend for this book. 2.5 feels a little elevated as well. And that's the tricky part at the lower grades. There's a lot more demand at the lower grades. More people can actually participate at those grades. So maybe it's holding up a little bit better. But you can see like there was an 18.5 sale last year, a lot lower than everything else. I wonder if there's something maybe really wrong with it. Looks like maybe that was an eBay sale, 18,500, because there's no link. But generally it'd been going to 23 to 24, and it's been pretty stable for almost a year and a half now. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that the Amazing Fantasy 15 general market right now is in a pretty good place. If this is a book that you have been waiting to pick up, then it is probably a reasonable time to go after it. Just, you don't need to overpay. There are quite a few copies of Amazing Fantasy 15 out there. If we take a look at the CGC census, you can see that there are 2,510 universals, 3,851 total. There are quite a few copies. They do come up for sale on Heritage at least every few weeks. And I've been seeing them every week again for the last few weeks. So there are plenty of opportunities. Just keep your eyes open. If that's a book you've been looking for, go for it. But that's all I wanted to talk about. I mean, I can't imagine losing $46,000 on one book like that. I feel bad for the person. It's wild. It was wild to see. I mean, obviously, this purchase at 66 was a massive overpay when that was bought. I mean, this was what was paid there was approximately a universal price at the time. And so you wonder if maybe the person didn't fully understand what the green label meant. But man, if you're spending $66,000 on a book, I hope you'd fully understand what the green label meant. But yeah, brutal. But hopefully you enjoyed this video. If you did, please hit that like button, subscribe button, notification bell, all that kind of stuff. Got more videos over here. If you'd like to watch some of my other videos, subscription button is right here. If you'd like to subscribe to the channel, I'd really appreciate it. And I will see you in the next video.